Thank you so much for that intro, Solange, and thank you guys for having us here tonight. I'm really excited to delve into this panel with our esteemed panelists. As Solange mentioned, this is about public policy and flipping social paradigms, and I'm a cannabis policy reporter, so I'm a little biased, but I can't think of a better way into exploring these ideas of flipping social paradigms through policy than a topic like cannabis. So to start off, I'd like the panelists to briefly introduce themselves. Eliza, do you want to start?
Sure, gladly. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I have been a public defender in Manhattan for the past 10 years. So I've represented over 3,000 New Yorkers who have been charged with crimes in this city who couldn't afford to hire an attorney. And every day in court, I've gone up against the Manhattan District Attorney's Office and Cy Vance, and against a criminal punishment bureaucracy that is cruel and unjust, one that is rigged for the rich and powerful and against everyone else. I've come up against this system that's designed to systematically disenfranchise so many people, Black and brown people, lower income people, LGBTQIA folks, sex workers, those who are not powerful and not connected. And I like to say it's not that our criminal justice system is broken. It's the problem is it's working exactly as designed, exactly as a rigged system is supposed to. And it is disenfranchising the very people it is designed to disenfranchise. And I know we're going through these dark times right now, but I know that we can do better and we need a change. And we are seeing catalysts for change across the country. And we're seeing change in places like San Francisco and Philadelphia and Boston as to the district attorney. And I've never, as a prosecutor, I certainly had never aspired to be one, but I realized that if we want to change the system, we have to change the DA. And so I am running to be Manhattan District Attorney and to bring bold transformational change and a new vision for New York to that office.
Thank you. Jessica?
All right, so hi everyone. So I'm Jess Gonzalez. I am a cannabis and intellectual property attorney out of a firm based in New Jersey. I'm also outside general counsel for the national organization Minorities for Medical Marijuana, and I also sit on the policy committee for the Minority Cannabis Business Association, and I'm also one of the folks involved in the legalization campaign here in New Jersey. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. And Kareem?
I'm the CEO of a social equity platform called Fourth Movement. It's a for-profit platform that trains, vets, helps folks apply who qualify for social equity, and then surrounds them with all the tools necessary to compete at the highest level. And we focus in the retail space.
Thank you, guys. So to start off, I kind of wanted to go off of what Aaliyah was talking about earlier and the importance of elections. Maybe Eliza, you could chime in on the importance of elections and changing the criminal legal system. And also, I'm curious about your thoughts on, what this current moment means for elections. Like, do you think that all the recent protests are going to, drive people to turn out more for elections and really carry through to November?
I really truly do. And I think that this moment that we are living through is a historic one. And we've seen in the past that protests catalyze change, that people get energized. I mean, we've seen it in New York. Stonewall started as a riot. The first Pride was a riot. And this is something that right now, finally, people are waking up to the things that those who've been, on the front lines and in the trenches have been screaming about for years, but that all of these systems of structural racism and systemic oppression that exist must be dismantled. And so those of us who are allies, who are, white, who have the privilege of having a skin color that has benefited us throughout our lives, must actively be speaking out and fighting to dismantle these systems and using our privilege in a tangible way. And so I think that so many are finally waking up to that and recognizing how critical elections are, and that not all Democrats are created equal and everybody has to be engaged in the political process. And, in terms of my election, like, a district attorney is probably the most important elected official that maybe you don't even know. Charging decision for what crimes get charged, who gets charged, who doesn't get charged, what charges are brought, what pleas are offered, whether someone has the opportunity for treatment, whether bail is set. And it's just such a wide-ranging impact that that person can have, even if laws aren't changed. As district attorney, I can say, well, here in Manhattan, we are no longer prosecuting low-level drug offenses. We're not prosecuting any cannabis-related offenses. That's it, period. It's done, even if it hasn't gone through the process of being legalized. So local elections are just absolutely critical.
Yeah, and talking more about cannabis policy, I feel like recently, the topic of expungements is now something that, lawmakers from both sides of the aisle can get on board with. But topics of, social equity programs and community reinvestment, those tend to be more dicey politically. And it's one of the reasons why legalization hasn't passed in New York yet. And the panel before, Kelly was saying how, diversity doesn't equal equity. And I'm wondering, maybe Kareem, if you can weigh in on like how social equity programs are working in California and whether they're actually doing what their goals are to actually create power for marginalized communities.
Well, they're not yet. I think the jury is still out. I think that there's a divergence on what the definition is when you say the word social equity and or what it ought to be. And so whether or not you're talking to a policymaker or a regulator or folks in business or individuals who qualify for social equity, sometimes you may get different definitions. A lot of times we think about social equity as the policy that creates this limited licensing possibility for individuals who then have to apply. And obviously more people want the opportunity, then there's going to be opportunity available to get one of these limited license opportunities. But to me, that's not social equity. Those policies are ends to a means, supposedly, but in order to leverage the word equity, you gotta say, what does equitable mean? What does that mean? And to me, it means people actually existing or living in our country equitably. So when you create a program that's leveraging the opportunity to do business, that means that the business has to be successful enough that people enjoy the resources or the fruits from that business in a way that produce equitable outcomes. And all those things have to happen. And we haven't seen any policy because, first of all, the policy is not married to access to capital. And in cannabis, access to capital is very, very, very difficult because it's federally illegal and banks and most of Wall Street isn't involved, and it's just so limited. So the jury is still out. At the end of the day, what's to be judged is whether or not via regulation, we end up with human beings from communities that have been disproportionately impacted by cannabis arrest, living equitably in their community, or in LA, for example, where it costs $600,000 to purchase the average cost of a home. And do people's kids go to competitive schools? And do they begin to build wealth? And do they get equitable health outcomes? And so, and then how many people get to do that versus who's currently licensed? If we're experiencing 60% Black and browns, closer to 70% of the ramifications of criminal justice, and have less than 1% of all the licenses in the country, that's another discussion or a focus point around what equity is and ought to be.
Mm-hmm. And Jessica, I know you're working on the New Jersey campaign. Where are your thoughts at in terms of what equity could look like in New Jersey? What are you learning from other places like California? What are some of the pitfalls you are seeing as far as policy is concerned?
Yeah, sure. And so, I think so New York and New Jersey really do have the late mover advantage, right, of being able to look to other states of what's been implemented. But I think also, like, speaking to what Kareem said, it's very hard to assess the how successful these social equity programs have been because it hasn't been really enough time. But from what we've already seen, a lot of times the infrastructure isn't there to even support a lot of this pretty language that they include in a lot of bills. And one thing that we're seeing is a lot of states are really recycling the same type of language and adding their own caveats into it, where they may think they're being particularly creative, but really they're creating more restrictions in the space. And so I think in terms of what really we can learn is that if social equity is not the epicenter of legalization, if that's not a conversation that's had way in advance of legalization, it's much harder then to implement these programs around a structure, a regulatory structure that wasn't really supposed to include social equity from the beginning, really, until a lot of advocates really started coming to the forefront, right? You look at Colorado, who had a legal market, the first legal market, and they just implemented a social equity program, I believe, 3 weeks ago to a month, right? And so now when you look at kind of, the speed at which this is happening, my worry is that they're going to recycle this language just because it looks nice, it looks pretty, it's going to get folks to really get on board, but the implementation is going to be borderline disastrous because that's really, what we've seen. So I think what needs to happen is that states really need to recognize that an infrastructure needs to exist, and there needs to be cooperation between, elected officials, between public health officials, between, chambers of commerce who really deal with small businesses, between law enforcement, because if not, all of this pretty language really falls to the wayside. And one thing that I've really been advocating a lot in terms of specific policy language are having timelines of when things are supposed to occur, right? Because if not, then, take, for example, New Jersey has in their new medical bill that a Office of Development for Minorities, Disabled Veterans, and Women are supposed to exist, but there's no actual timeline as to when that's supposed to happen. So if folks are advocating for Social Equity Day 1, they may be looking at Social Equity Day 562. So it's really important to make sure that timelines are included in this, statutorily enacted. That way there's some sort of, this is going to happen at this point, because a lot of times what we've also seen are the timelines to apply for these licenses are sometimes broken. So it needs to be a little bit more transparent as well. And then just the infrastructure, that includes educational programs and certain, incubator programs, well, and a lot of technical assistance and access to professional services, because as Kareem was saying, access to capital is so hard to come by, but it's not just that, it's access to it's financial capital, it's access to human capital. And so a lot of these programs need to really exist from the onset, but it needs to be done extremely intentionally. And I don't think we've seen that just yet.
I think it's important, if I could just add on, I thought, Jess, that was outstanding. I agree with every single word that you said. I think it's really important to understand the framework. And so social equity programs right now are only happening because they're activists and progressive policymakers. That's why, it doesn't exist in Oklahoma, doesn't exist in some of these in Missouri. It does exist in California, in multiple cities in Massachusetts, and it will in New York, it will in New Jersey, it does in Illinois. But there were first movers, and the first movers are very influential in any policy that gets through as it's negotiated, like most policy in state houses or in city halls or in county buildings. And those first movers who are by and large publicly traded, run by predominantly white men with mostly all white boards, have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. And that is to continue to increase their market share. And so what you see in Illinois is carve-outs that are going to be, extremely punitive or going to make it more difficult to get the outcome that was intended with the social equity program. So we'll see what happens in the next couple of months when 74 of those licenses are issued, how many actually go to African-American or Latino people who come from communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. You'll see what happened in their craft grow legislation, which allows people to basically have a sharecropper type relationship with MSOs who have all the medical licenses in Illinois. No people of color have any of those licenses. No people of color or people of color-led companies have any of the licenses in New York. And so, that is the framework. The people with the power and the resources and any semblance of success at scale in this industry are not aligned with the interest of social equity generally. It's not in their why. it's not why they're in business. They're in business to gain as much market share as they can in cannabis. And I believe that most of social equity licenses will end up being distressed assets that will be acquired by these same first movers who will leverage them inexpensively to increase their market share over time.
So, I mean, these MSOs you're talking about, they are the ones with capital, and they are the ones with the power in the industry right now. And a lot of them are talking a lot about the importance of social equity and the importance of social justice within cannabis legalization. But it seems like fewer are actually acting in a way towards those goals. What do you see at, like, hypothetically, let's just say there was a multi-state operator who genuinely wanted to support the goals of social equity? What would you look to them to be doing? What actions are you looking for to back that up?
Investing in people of color and those ideas and businesses that have the ability to attack the opportunity one way or another. So, folks with the cultural competency, the acumen, and the plan in order to invest directly into, folks who get licenses, who have business models that seem like they're scalable, like they can grow. Do that. Exchange some of the investment for shelf space agreements where you can sell at reasonable pricing some of your product into those stores. Incubate businesses and finance businesses that can, grow to be competitive with respect to market share in those jurisdictions in any state. That's what they can do. It's got to be an equity conversation. I don't really want to hear about, like, we're going to donate XYZ amount of money to this cause, or we're going to be focused on jobs and reentry. Like, all that's cool, but it's not going to increase people's ability to exist equitably or really address the opportunity that should be addressed around cannabis, which is ownership and competitiveness. And if cannabis becomes a, you call it, $50 billion industry in the United States over the next however many years, how much of that money is going to the hands of people of color? And I think we ought to be measuring that versus, what percentage of people who have been harmed by the policies that this country espoused.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to go back to something Jessica was saying about equity being sort of like a central part of the legalization discussion. And I'm just wondering how all of you as advocates handle your advocacy when it comes to idealism and pragmatism, because, sometimes with advocacy, you want to stick to your ideals. Others are more pragmatic and say, well, there are people in power, we have to compromise with them. And I mean, Jessica, how do you go about sort of balancing those two things and navigating all of those competing interests?
Yeah, sure. And this is something that I feel that a lot of folks really struggle with, right? Is that we come to the table with a lot of idealistic, views and perspectives and ideas of what we want to see happen. But a lot of times those idealistic views don't come with practical solutions or avenues of possibility. And so that's where I think that if advocates really want to get to the meat of what needs to happen, they need to figure out how to make it happen, as opposed to just really rah-rah-rahing for it to happen, right? Because I think a lot of times we assume that a lot of these politicians that we're talking to understand, our issues in cannabis or our matters as much as we do. And typically they don't, right? We're dealing with a lot of times one issue, they're dealing with about 50. And so if you don't come to them with something in writing with, some sort of solutions, hey, this state has done it that way. Hey, here's a model bill. Here's what we're looking at. Who can I talk to? Who, in the municipality, getting a lot of the municipalities involved, I think is a very, very huge step. So I think that a lot of folks sometimes get very upset that things don't happen. But the problem is that if we want it to happen, we cannot count on them to make it happen, right? We've seen this over and over again, that we cannot rely on a lot of our politicians and legislators to really make shit happen. But we really need to take on that responsibility, you know, on ourselves to say, okay, well, here are the pathways to make it happen. And that's kind of what I've been doing in New Jersey, is figuring out who are the people who need to be spoken to, who are the people who really are going to have the solutions. Because I can't just say, hey, I want you to fund an educational program. They're going to ask me, well, where is that money going to come from? And then I need to provide, you know, solutions in that sense. So I think one thing that folks, you know, even as any advocate can really do is, if you really want to press this issue, but come to the table with, you know, of, hey, this is how I think it should be done, but in, you know, in practical terms, and really playing that balancing act as best we can. And I think regardless, we're going to have to compromise. This thing is not going to, you know, go right the first time around. And I don't think that for us to think that it is going to be perfect the first time around is extremely naive. So we have to be able to lay some foundation, I believe, at first, in order to get certain things. But that's not to say, you know, compromise on your ideals and values, but find ways to go about it, and talk to them in economics, because that's the type of things that they understand.
Yeah. Eliza, do you have anything to add? I imagine, you know, DAs have a similar sort of balancing act to play in terms of the policies that their offices develop.
Absolutely. And, you know, district attorneys don't have legislative power, but they have such a wide-reaching power in making prosecuting decisions. And the current DA's office, at least here in Manhattan, is one that's like kind of rotten at its core, at the foundation. And so I think that there are these like maximal changes that need to be made, but that the system constrains you. So right now, obviously, you know, in New York, marijuana has been decriminalized, but not legalized. And so it's being used as a justification for police interactions with communities of color. And so law enforcement continues to use it as a tool to target and bring violence against communities and arrest people at higher rates. And, you know, until we fully legalize recreationally, you know, just across the board, then law enforcement continues to maintain the discretion to criminalize certain populations and not others. And so we have to completely remove police from the role of enforcement in this skewed enforcement, this racist enforcement. And so as district attorney, at least even if you can't participate in the lawmaking legislative duties, you can say, I will never prosecute something that is the basis of which was the smell of marijuana, of cannabis, you know, that won't be allowed to be used, because we've seen it time and time again just be used in such a racist fashion. And so though it is something that, you know, we have to think about in terms of like what enforcement looks like, even if it's decriminalized, I think it just has to be taken into consideration, you know, everything that comes from that. And here in, you know, what I've seen as a public defender time and time again is just the massive consequences on people's lives. Decriminalization is certainly not sufficient. You know, a marijuana violation, meaning it's not even a crime. If someone is convicted of that and they are a non-citizen, that is an aggravated felony under immigration law. That person can be ordered removed, can be deported from this country for minor non-criminal possession of marijuana. You can lose custody of your children, be ineligible for school loans, mortgages, public housing, you know, all of these things. And it's obviously disproportionately affecting certain populations. And so it has to be, you know, centered on just figuring out how to either legalize or have people in power who are not going to continue to perpetuate this racist, oppressive way in which these laws have been used.
Yeah, and we have several minutes before the end of the panel, so I want to open it up to questions. So if anybody wants to ask a question, go ahead and hit the Q&A button. And we have one question about why social equity programs have failed to live up to their vision and mission in every market that have launched these programs. I feel like we've touched on some of the issues already, but is there anything else, any other reasons you guys are seeing for why these programs are not being successful in their goals?
So I think really the main thing that I touched on is just the infrastructure is just not there to support them by any means. And then I don't think that there is a tremendous amount of pressure, because if it's not in the statute, if it's not in the bill, if it's not in some sort of governing law, then they're going to drag their feet on it. And so I think that a lot of times there are no sort of timelines as to when things need to occur. And I think that has definitely been a major problem. But I think one part also is no one has really agreed on what the definition of a social equity applicant is in the first place. And I think that that has been something that a lot of us have really been grappling with, of who does qualify as a social equity applicant, because, in some states, it can become almost overly restricted, the definition of a social equity applicant. And some it's more open-ended, that can easily be manipulated. And so I think trying to narrow down a solid definition is going to be hard, because every state really has their own kind of laws and very, past history with the criminalization of this plan. But I think that has been an issue of who qualifies and who doesn't, and then who gets the resources and who doesn't.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think there's an information gap between the policymaker and what it takes to win in the industry, which is you don't get equity unless the businesses are winning businesses that are attached to the license. And so, if you're the policymaker, first of all, every politician's number one desire is to get reelected. And so, you've got pressure of their constituents that they take into consideration. And by and large, most policymakers don't have the background that's consistent with understanding what does it take to run a successful cultivation or manufacturing or delivery or retail business. They just don't have it. And so now they're charged to regulate that and determine, who is going to get the opportunity, and how do you do that in a way that seems fair to the public, without ever asking, what are we trying to reverse engineer? What's the outcome that we really want? And then answering that question honestly, and reverse engineering the policy. So I think generally we're going to see some outliers and people who get the opportunity and end up doing very well. But by and large, when we start really seeing, you have 100 invoices that were issued in Los Angeles so far. Of those 100, I think 18 were African American. I'm not really sure the Latino number, but there were a lot of non-Black and brown people that weren't the majority of the licenses issued weren't the majority of the people where I think that the program was intended for were the recipients. And so, we've already started off just saying, like, then you get to the probability of the success of those businesses, right? Access to capital, acumen, all of those kinds of things in a very, very, very difficult retail environment, even made even more complicated by COVID and the post-COVID environment and the reliance on technology and delivery to be able to compete.
Yeah. Yeah. And we just got another audience question. I feel like I probably should have addressed this earlier in the panel. How would you explain social equity to someone who has never heard the term before?
Go for it, Jess.
Oh, all right. So I was going to say, I didn't know who's going to go. So I would say for me, social equity is really providing folks the opportunity, like the resources really to go after the same opportunities as anybody else, specifically those that have been affected by the criminalization of this plant. Because I think what's happening is you can't just give a license to somebody who's never run a business before. You can't also throw a ton of money at folks who really have never, built a business before. And so a lot of these resources are really needed in sort of, the education and business acumen and access to professional services, because just saying, well, X number of folks are going to get a license or X number of folks are going to get loans and grants, really that could also just be setting them up to fail. And it's something really that, I'm starting to see in New Jersey with a couple of these social equity initiatives that are not particularly fleshed out real well, and I find to be quite predatory, because once again, it's kind of allocating these either license or money, but without providing infrastructure to help them succeed once they get there.
Yeah. And
I think an example that's helpful to people when I've mentioned it, and not to to align with their, let's just say, politics, but what they actually do, which is social equity, is like the Chick-fil-A brand, where they're owner operators, by and large, operate one unit, and they have $10,000 in a deal, which is probably $1.5 million unit, and their average income is north of $350,000. Whereas Chick-fil-A did the real estate and spent all of the money up front to really stand that business up, notwithstanding $10,000. That's social equity, where people who would otherwise be paid general manager salary at 60 or 80 or 90 or $100,000 a year are making 350,000, and they're living equitably in those communities where those units are located. And the units typically operate better because people are more committed and they don't turn over. So I think that is social equity, and I think so we're going to see social equity, especially in the post George Floyd environment that we're in outside of cannabis. That's going to be successful with proven concepts. That's what I'm hearing and seeing, and so I think we can look outside of the industry to what's worked, to look for what might work in this industry.
You guys, we are out of time. I want to thank you all so much for participating in this panel. We didn't even get to talk about community reinvestment, so I hope everyone who's listening will go look that up and learn more about that, because I think that's another really important part of this discussion. So thank you to our panelists, and thank you, Humble Bloom and Ms. Grass, for having us.
God bless everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.